So we are going to kick off the show, and one of our guests is going to be joining us shortly. I wanted to give a quick introduction of what this show is going to generally be about. Generally speaking, we're going to be doing mostly pre-recorded shows. This is in some way a one-off, a live stream, and we decided to do that largely because of what's happening in the streets with the uprisings around the killing of George Floyd. Next week, actually, we're going to have a pre-recorded show that's going to lay out for millions of people the realities around the unemployment system and the incredible crisis that many millions of workers are facing when they actually try to access the unemployment system. If you are coming to this show for the first time, please do subscribe here at the YouTube channel, and then you'll be able to get notices on our future shows. And we'd love to have you participate in either emailing me, jtassini@workinglife.org, or you can submit questions here after we've had this discussion with my guests, who I'm about to introduce in a couple of minutes. As I said, we are going to take on today the question of the link between racism and economic exploitation. And we're going to do that with an incredible panel. The first guest, who is going to join us soon, he's having technical difficulties getting in, as sometimes that happens with Zoom, is Steve Greenhouse. And he is the author of an incredibly amazing new book called Beaten Down, Worked Up: The Past, Present, and Future of American Labor. And you can see that on your screen now. Steve was a labor reporter, workplace and labor reporter for the New York Times for 19 years. And actually, the book is out July 21st in paperback. Now, one of the things you're going to hear me talk about, and a theme that I have, is do not buy these books from Amazon. I have this obsession about not giving money to Amazon. So buy Steve's book at an independent bookstore. For example, Powell's.com, which is one of the stores that actually had to close up because of the pandemic, but is really struggling. And it's, I think, our duty as independent operators, as activists, as political people, to support those kinds of independent bookstores. I want to introduce my other two guests. Steve will join us soon. Really great guests. People have been on my show before, my audio podcast. The first is Randi Weingarten, the president of the American Federation of Teachers, who's waving to us. And then my brother, Tefere Gebre, who is the executive vice president of the Afl-Cio. And I thought to pose the conversation and then have us listen to a quick clip that I pulled, and I used actually in my regular audio podcast this week. The question is, police brutality on its own merits obviously is something to confront. But tonight we're going to try to consider exactly what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said repeatedly, that there was always a link between racism and police brutality, between racism and economic exploitation. And so I want us to listen to a clip from Dr. King from a speech that he gave called The Other America in 1967, which I think will set the standard for this conversation.
But we must see that the struggle today is much more difficult. It's more difficult today because we are struggling now for genuine equality. And it's much easier to integrate a lunch counter than it is to guarantee a livable income and a good, solid job. It's much easier to guarantee the right to vote than it is to guarantee the right to live in sanitary, decent housing conditions. It is much easier to integrate a public park than it is to make genuine, quality, integrated education a reality. And so today we are struggling for something which says we demand genuine equality. It's not merely a struggle against extremist behavior toward Negroes. And I'm convinced that many of the very people who supported us in the struggle in the South are not willing to go all the way now. I came to see this in a very difficult and painful way in Chicago over the last year, where I've lived and worked. Some of the people who came quickly to march with us in Selma and Birmingham, were active around Chicago. And I came to see that so many people who supported morally and even financially what we were doing in Birmingham and Selma were really outraged against the extremist behavior of Bull Connor and Jim Clark toward Negroes, rather than believing in genuine equality for Negroes.
So we heard that clip, and I thought that was a really good way of putting the context on our conversation. And Steve, I introduced your incredible book ahead of time. Again, the book is Beaten Down, Worked Up, The Past, Present, and Future of American Labor. And I wanted you to start from your perspective, how what Dr. King said is really woven through your book when you're talking about the way in which organized labor has organized for working class people, for people of color, for African Americans. You can go back, as you point out in your book, you talked about the history of the UAW and Walter Reuther and the way they stood up for people of color, all the way to today, the fight for 15, the things you cover in your book extensively. Give us a sense of that.
Okay, first, Jonathan, I feel great to be here. Sorry about the delay in getting on Zoom. It's great to be with you. It's an honor to be with two terrific labor leaders, Tafari and Randi. Thanks so much for joining us. So the labor movement has played a tremendous role in lifting people of color in the United States. Dr. King famously said that the civil rights movement can't succeed without the labor movement, and the labor movement can't succeed without the civil rights movement, because neither of them is strong enough to really do it on its own. And you know, with great leaders like Dr. King and Walter Reuther, you know, labor and the civil rights movement really work together. People forget that the great March on Washington in 1963 was financed in large part by the United Auto Workers, and that the main person behind that was the head of the Sleeping Car Porters Union, A. Philip Randolph, you know, a famous union president. So unions have done a tremendous amount lifting African Americans, and you know, I could probably talk for 2 hours about that. I'll try to condense it into 2 minutes. You know, 1941 was one of the biggest unionization victories in American history. Unionized Ford Motor Company. Henry Ford was extremely anti-union. And it was only through a strike at the River Roots plant, then the largest factory in the world, where African-American workers banded together with Caucasian workers and walked out, you know, tens of thousands of workers. And that got Ford to finally recognize a union, over 70,000 workers. And that, along with what happened at General Motors and Chrysler and United States Steel, really led to some amazing union contracts that went very far to build the middle class and lift many African-American workers into the middle class. You know, fast forward, the Memphis Sanitation Workers strike in 1968, and I have a major chapter about that. There, some hugely exploited sanitation workers in Memphis who felt tremendous racism and discrimination day after day. They couldn't get promotions. They were paid terribly. 40% of them earned so little that their families were on welfare or on food stamps. They went on strike, and the labor movement really got behind them. The American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees. Dr. King came into Memphis to fight for them. They had the famous "I Am a Man" placard that they wore, that 1,000 of them wore as they marched silently through Memphis. And that became a major strike to really bring labor rights and dignity to African-American workers in Memphis. And with that victory, at the tremendous cost of the assassination of Dr. King in Memphis, with that victory, that really went far to lift many African-American workers in the South. And then fast forward now to the Fight for 15, which began in 2012. You know, it began as a very small effort to create a $15 minimum wage for fast food workers and unionize them. And now here we are 8 years later. Thanks to the Fight for 15, it's raised the wages of something like 20 million workers, 25 million workers, many of them African Americans and Latinx and Asian Americans. And the 5 to 15 has really shown, what a smart, skilled, innovative movement can do to lift low-wage workers, especially workers of color. And I just want to end with something that Randy knows far more about than I do. But the teacher strikes, the Red for Ed strikes. Take the Chicago teacher strike, and which is really a fight to improve education for a school district that is largely children of color. Ditto in Los Angeles. That was a strike where before the strike, the teachers were offered a raise of 6% over 2 years. They're demanding smaller class size, more librarians, more nurses, more school counselors, more green space. And it was really a fight to improve the lot of a school district that was overwhelmingly children of color. Ditto with the recent Chicago teacher strike. And when the LA teacher strike ended, the union agreed to the same 6% over 2 years that was offered to them, but they made major gains in what they were really focusing on: more librarians, more nurses, more school counselors, more green space, smaller class sizes. And they showed that a smart union, can really work with the community to achieve major gains for the overall community, for families of color, for children of color, to improve educations, to make, kids' futures much better. And I'll let Randy talk about the major victory in Chicago, which was in many ways similar to the one in Los Angeles. But, bottom line, unions have done a huge amount for workers across the country, including many African-American, Hispanic, Asian workers. I just want to conclude with a quote from Dr. King in the first chapter of my book. He says, "The labor movement was the principal force that transformed misery and despair into hope and progress. Out of its bold struggles, economic and social reform gave birth to unemployment insurance, old age pensions, government relief for the destitute, and above all, new wage levels that meant not mere survival, but a tolerable life. The captains of industry did not lead this transformation. They resisted it until they were overcome." I'll stop there. Sorry I talked so much.
And you mentioned, Steve, your chapter, a really terrific chapter in your book, I Am a Man. And I, in fact, underlined the other quote from Dr. King. When he was speaking to the Afl-Cio, "You can't win without us, and we can't get a damn thing without you." So Randy, over to you. Steve underscored the kinds of struggles that you all had on behalf of teachers on the issue of both confronting race and also economic justice.
Right. So, I also want to I'm straddling, which is what we do right now, two conversations. The presumptive nominee is about to speak on another Zoom that I'm supposed to be on, but I wanted to do this, and I'll come back, but I wanted to do this, and particularly with Steve and Tafari, because I want to nest what Steve said into what's going on right now. We actually have, sorry to be the social studies teacher, 1968, 1929, and 1918 at the same exact time, in that there is a public health pandemic that has killed over 100,000 people. There is a economic pandemic or catastrophe that has unemployed at least 40 million people. We'll get actually a bigger number to this Friday. But beforehand, 40% of Americans couldn't put $400 together in an emergency, and think about what I just said in terms of unemployment. And now we have what I hope is a tipping point, because the justice crisis got so bad that we all saw video of 9 minutes of a white police officer murdering a Black man in custody who was crying out that he could not breathe. And instead of being helped by 3 other police officers, they all just watched or assisted in the murder. This is these 3 that have now are confronting us with a current president that just pours gasoline on it and makes it worse, not better. And so we have the circumstances to actually make bold reform if we can create like the circumstances in the early 30s, leadership, electoral leadership that will work with activism to create that reform. We need both politics and protest, activism and elections. And I think that's what you saw in terms of the teacher strikes, and that's what you're seeing in terms of the protest on the ground right now. You need to have both. It's not an either or, because what protest does is it forces people to watch and not to be silent and to be engaged, and particularly protest that makes things inconvenient. And that's what the teacher strikes were, and that is what this protest is right now. But the through line, and this is the last point I want to make right now, the through line in all of this is the inequity in this country, that the social contract of working hard, playing by the rules, ain't working for a lot of people, and that we need to rewrite the rules so that the economy and democracy is far fairer to working people, to people of color, to vulnerable people, not just to the rich and the powerful. And I think that's part of what the labor movement tries to do by having the infrastructure, that the vehicle to help do that. But it needs to be aligned, as Steve referred to in terms of Tafari and I, it actually needs to be aligned with the values of community and the values of our members, which thankfully in my arena, I'm very grateful. My members want to make a difference in the lives of the kids and the patients they serve every single day. I wouldn't say not all of them are as altruistic as I just said, but they see their lives in sync with those of community. And so it makes it easier for us to be out there supporting our students who are protesting right now, because that is what we also teach our students, to have that voice in the democracy and in our economy. And that is what we try to do as a union, have that voice to create the conditions, not just for our wages and benefits, which are very important, but to create the conditions we need to make sure that kids thrive and our patients are okay.
Thank you. Do you need to get to your
yes,
call?
I'm gonna just do
Okay, so then I'll move to Tafari. When you come back, we'll follow up with a question. One of the things, Tafari, I was thinking about is both Steve and Randy were answering this, was kind of a twofold thing. One is to just get your reaction on the connection between racism and economic exploitation and the way that Dr. King tied those two together. And the second thing, a more concrete question, for a lot of especially younger people, the labor movement doesn't necessarily have that place and that role or that visibility as the engine, the leader. And part of that may have to do with, frankly, the labor movement's smaller percentage-wise than, say, when our parents were growing up, when Steve talked about certainly the UAW. So a lot of people don't know what unions mean. How do you actually get the labor movement to, be the leader there and to take on and try to exploit and take advantage of what Randy just described?
Well, Jonathan, first of all, thank you for having me here. And I feel really privileged to be on the same spot with Randy Weingarten and Steve Greenhouse, who are household names in the labor movement. I was just listening to the clip from Dr. King, and when Steve was reading a line on his book. The honest truth is, we haven't made that much of a stride from those days. The opportunity gap that has existed between white people and people of color, especially African Americans. I don't know how we get around that to actually fill that opportunity gap, which creates a power gap, which creates a health gap, which creates community gap. So this pandemic is really exposing the underlying issues that we have had. African Americans are dying almost at 3 times the rate of white people from this disease, and that is happening because of a lethal combination of racism and inequality actually just showing themselves up. The latest statistics that I could find, the average net worth of a white household in the United States is $171,000. For a black household, it's $17,000. I'm sorry, unless we start making progress in that gap, really, we're just running in circles. We're not really, it's running like on a treadmill that you're getting tired, but you're not, your surroundings are not changing whatsoever. That's what attracted me about the labor movement. Why I got into the labor movement is what Steve said, what Randi said. Collective bargaining agreements have been the tools for Black people to get out and for people of color to get out of poverty and move up the ladder. So we have another combination that's happening, that's attack on unions, attack on collective bargaining rights, which is direct attack on people of color.
I always like having you on the show because you don't gloss over the truth. And when you said we failed, I actually had similar statistics about the wealth of white families compared to African-American families. And so it really speaks to, frankly, the labor movement and its failure, number one, to organize enough people. And I know that there are barriers to that, as Steve has written very eloquently in his book about the legal barriers, the political barriers, but still, we have to take account over the last 30 or 40 years that those statistics say something about the failure of society, and also that unions have not actually instilled those collective bargaining agreements in a widespread enough place to narrow that gap, right? That was your point.
That was precisely what my point is. And we have left opportunities at the table, time after time. I could take you back to Occupy Wall Street. A massive amount of young people calling out the 1% on behalf of the 99%. We marched with them for a couple of weeks, but we're an institution. We did not have the capacity to institutionalize that movement, and that movement just went away. That's because institutions didn't jump in to actually institutionalize the gains that come after the movement. I don't want to institutionalize movements, but institutions are there to capture the gains that a movement has and institutionalize them to survive for decades and centuries. Instead, what is surviving still in this country is the institution of slavery. We have gotten rid of it on paper, but it still is present in this country. And that is the honest conversation that people have to have.
Steve,
I just want to
jump
follow
in?
up.
Yeah, please.
So following up on what Tafari said, so Occupy Wall Street was great because it put the issue of, the 1% inequality on the map, but it did not really have an institution. It was like it was anarchistic and had no institution. And to really make serious progress, it's important to have powerful institutions. And as Randi and Tefere were saying, America now is extremely broken. We have the worst income inequality of any industrialized nation. As Tafari just said, the economic discrimination, economic problems of African Americans are insanely bad in the United States. The wealth inequality and what we're seeing with COVID-19 and the much higher death rate for African Americans, a much higher foreclosure rate, and then the racial justice crisis is mind-bogglingly bad. And it just I went to civil rights demonstrations in the 1960s with my parents, And here
You're
we
dating
are.
yourself, Steve. You're dating yourself.
Yeah, here we are 52 years later, and like it's astounding in ways how little progress we've made. And to make the progress that we as a nation made, we need movements like the folks out on the street now, the peaceful folks out on the street now. We need the environmental movement. We need Black Lives Matter. We need the kids from Florida who led the nationwide movement, to control guns. And we need the labor movement. And people forget, a lot of young people aren't that familiar with the labor movement. In the 1950s and 60s, in my parents' prime, labor movement was this extremely powerful movement. It represented more than 1 in 3 workers, and it really built the world's richest, biggest middle class. I explain that in detail in my book, and people were able to buy cars and buy homes and send their kids to colleges, and it really made a huge difference in improving the standard of living for many Americans, including many African Americans. Not enough. And as the union movement has unfortunately grown weaker from representing 1 in 3 workers to 1 in 10, corporate power has gotten much stronger. Things have gotten much more out of balance in the nation. Income inequality is way out of whack. Wall Street has tons of power. The focus on profit maximization has led to all these companies moving plants overseas, squeezing unions, pushing down wages, reducing health benefits and pension benefits. So things are really broken for workers. Things are really broken, especially for workers of color. And it's important to have a strong workers movement, a strong union movement to help right the very broken American ship. And what we're seeing now with workers at Amazon and workers at Whole Foods and McDonald's, and all these workers are convinced that their employers are not doing nearly enough to help them, stay safe from COVID-19. And God, what's been happening in the meatpacking and poultry plants and the hundreds and hundreds, the thousands of COVID-19 cases there, workers are crying for help. They say, we are being treated like crap, and we need our government to do something for us, and the government isn't doing nearly enough for them. So that means all the more we need a stronger workers movement, a stronger union movement to fight for workers, to make sure they have basic safety on the job, to make sure that their wages are pretty good. Now 40 million workers have lost their jobs in the past 2 months, and we need strong unions to fight for a fair unemployment insurance system, because that is also so broken, because so many states, starve their unemployment insurance system to make corporations happy, and they don't mind screwing workers when workers become unemployed. So something is really out of whack in America, and a big reason for that is worker power is so much weaker here. Unions are so much weaker here than in other industrial nations. And perhaps the main theme of my book is that America would be a much fairer place, would treat everyone much better if there was a strong bona fide workers movement and union movement.
And in fact, Steve has a great recitation in his book, and I promote it again, Beaten Down, Worked Up, the Past, Present, and Future of American Labor. He talks a lot about the barriers that are inherent in society, the legal barriers to organizing, the way in which politicians go after the labor movement. Randi certainly has had that experience when it comes to the attack through the Janus decision in the Supreme Court, the attack on public sector workers. I want to ask Tafari one thing to follow up on one of the things that Steve mentioned and raised. So with all those barriers that we have, why is it, from your perspective, looking at workers throughout the country, when you come in contact with them, I think we have to be honest that there have been, and Dr. King said that both in his speech and in the point that the comment that Steve had in the chapter I Am a Man. The reality is that some people view some unions and some elements of the union as racist, as not welcoming to people of color. Now, I know that's changed somewhat, but what's been your experience in terms of that interaction of trying to bring in workers of color into the labor movement?
Well, you're right. A lot of young people do say that. they don't feel like it's the labor movement is there. That was, I would say, a few years back. Now we see poll after poll. We see survey after survey. Millennials and youngers and even millennials, they think unions are their salvation. They want to join unions. They want to, they want to be represented by unions. The Amazon workers that Steve talked about, they don't have a union, but they're struggling against the mighty company, wanting to be in a union. But in order for that to happen, we have to change the rules that govern this country. It's not like you just knock on a door and you just join a union, or us knocking on a door of a worker and saying, come in to join the union. The system is rigged. The system is rigged. Corporations have rigged the system so that people don't join the unions and strengthen the unions. As everybody knows, when you strengthen the labor movement, when you strengthen the unions, you create vibrant, stronger communities. So the demise of low-wage workers and the life they live in is tied to the attacks that happens to our movement. To our movement. The $15 an hour, the 15 is a great deal. Paid sick leave movements are a great deal, but there isn't anything. There isn't a better panacea than actually workers sitting across the table from their employers and demanding what's rightfully theirs through a collective bargaining agreement. We know that right and left. We just need policy makers who can understand that, and in order to make a vibrant neighborhood in America, to create a better America, we need to have democracy at the workplace and allow workers who want to join a union to join unions. It's not that simple. Corporations are loaded up with lawyers whose entire job is to just deny workers that right to have the freedom at work. So those are the things that are loaded up on us. But there are ways to get to the other side of the other side of the building. Randi chaired a commission before I got elected into Afl-Cio. That's where I got to know Randi, was a convention commission. And with Randi's leadership, we went out and we had listening sessions with the community. Hundreds and hundreds of listening sessions with the community to understand what the community needs and explaining like how crucial the labor movement is. So I wish we pivot to that more. I wish we continue those conversations. I wish we take our conversations out of Washington, D.C. and have them in our communities so that we can start rebuilding that bond between the community and the labor movement. But young people are really, really hungry to join a union and have a collective bargaining agreement.
So I want to encourage our viewers to start submitting questions there at YouTube, and we'll moderate them, and as the questions come in, we'll throw them to our incredible panel. And Randi's back with us. And I had a question that I was reserving for you, Randi. It has to do with the public sector, which you are one of the great leaders in the public sector. And I wonder what you would think about the following. It seems to me that racism plays out in economic terms in ways that sometimes we don't see. And here's what I mean about the public sector, that African Americans are overrepresented as a share of the population in public sector jobs. And part of that, I think, was because the public sector, there was somewhat easier access to jobs. There was less racism than in the private sector. So when you have a Congress, especially Republicans like Mitch McConnell, blocking aid to go to states that have been devastated by the pandemic, and states are then going to have to cut budgets because unless we force them to raise taxes on the rich, they're going to cut jobs and they're going to go after people's pensions. So isn't that a very subtle way that we don't see that is in fact racism?
So I don't think you actually even have to look at the subtleties. It's pretty obvious when you have, after Hurricane Katrina, even the so-called Democratic reformers decided that it was in their interest to fire the entire teaching force of New Orleans, which made up basically 10% of the New Orleans middle class, Black middle class, that they fired. When you saw Michelle Rhee fire basically, in the guise of saying, we want better teaching, fired basically the Black middle class in Washington, D.C., because what happened was we were able to integrate public services faster than we were able to integrate other jobs in America. So I think we do have to call this out for what it is. But racism, you don't have to look for racism. You see it is, what has to happen is we have to be sentient about it, and we have to be willing to look at it and not hide our eyes. I think that the issue, though, that you're raising, Jonathan, is that there are three ways that, maybe more than three, but there are three basic ways that regular people create power. One is through voting, another is through public education, and the third is through union organization. And the right wing, and Steve talks about this, you just talked about it a lot. Think about I would say just in the last 2 days, I heard the following. Number one, Texas has decided that it's going to take away dues deduction from all of its public sector workers. Just out of nowhere. They couldn't get it out of Janus. They saw that we have actually continued to organize post-Janus. So just like Alaska, they think that they're gonna just take this away to make it harder for us to actually have a union and to finance a union. And in the same 24 hours, the National Labor Relations Board has all of a sudden decided that workers have lost their ability to actually discuss whether or not to have a union on work time. So it is this constant, so you think about, nest that with forbidding graduate workers to organize, even though today we just, because of a private agreement we had with Brown, we just had the third agreement in the COVID era with a university. Georgetown grads, Oregon, our Oregon unit with the Oregon State University, and now Brown. So to Tafari's point, people want a union for all sorts of different things, but the inability for contingent workers to organize, the inability for grad workers to organize, the constant attacks on whether somebody is a joint employer. All of these things are arrayed by the bosses who have gazillions of dollars to stop people from organizing. And yet the labor movement, the public sector, is continuing to grow. And that is why you see people like Mitch McConnell say, let's bankrupt their pensions, let's bankrupt states. So it is all part of the same effort to stop people from actually having any kind of empowerment over their own lives.
But isn't it specifically, just to put the point on it, do you think it's true that this attack on state governments, pensions, and workers is effectively racist because it's targeting a large proportion of African Americans and people of color who have those?
Well, it's effectively racist and it's effectively sexist. Yep. Because you have a union advantage for African Americans, for Hispanic workers, yep, for women, if they are in unions, and the union movement, the density in the union movement is in the public sector. So yes, it's effectively racist, it's effectively homophobic, it's effectively sexist. But the bigger issue is we need to actually see class and race issues as side by side in terms of creating more fairness and justice in this country.
As Dr. King said.
I'm going to jump in. I would frame it a different way. So clearly, people in the bottom 50% who are disproportionately, families of color, need government more. They can't afford to send their kids to fancy private schools. They don't have $10 million saved up for their retirement. They need Social Security. A lot of them need food stamps. They need government. And when Mitch McConnell or Republicans try to take an axe to the budgets of all 50 states, that's going to mean, cuts in teachers and cuts in food stamp administrators and cuts in sanitation. And who's that going to hurt most? It's going to hurt the non-rich, especially people in the bottom 50%. And that's, first and foremost, people of color. So is it racist or not? As Randy said, it's a disproportionate impact by far against poorer Americans. And unfortunately, a disproportionate percentage of them are people of color. I just want to follow up one thing that Tafari said. I imagine a lot of young people are asking, well, if unions are so popular, why aren't gazillions of workers pouring into unions right now? And that's a good question. I think a lot of people do not begin to realize how the playing field is stacked, is tilted hugely against unions. I would imagine that if you take any Amazon warehouse right now, and you could ask, the 3,000 or 5,000 workers, would you like to join the union today? I would bet, and many of them, majority of them would say yes, and they get a union. But it's infinitely harder than that. Union organizers are not allowed to set foot into an Amazon warehouse. They can't set foot onto the parking lot of an Amazon warehouse, whereas Amazon can force all its workers to sit through an hour or 3 hours or 5 hours of anti-union lectures from anti-union consultants, or show videos in the break room. So it's really hard. And as Randy said, the Trump administration, the Trump Labor Board, the Trump Department of Labor is trying to make it much, much harder for people to unionize. One thing that gets me is Donald Trump, who I think is, one of the world's greatest con men, when running for president said, I am a friend of workers. So if you're a friend of workers, you would want to give workers a greater voice in politics and in the workplace to help ensure that they can get a fair deal. But all across the board, the Trump administration is working to silence, to weaken, to cripple the voice of workers. So, how can you say you're a friend of workers when in effect your administration is doing everything it can to weaken the voice of workers, for workers to fight to try to get a fair deal?
So absolutely, playing field is tilted. We know the anti-union consultant business is a multi-billion-dollar business. Given that, Tafari, what can the labor movement do within that context? Where are the areas, for example, in terms of hiring organizers, the strategies that you see coming forward that you're thinking about, given that reality?
There must be a way, and there's always a way. And believe it or not, some of our unions actually have been growing under the Trump administration, despite what's happening. But in order for that to manifest itself, we also, as a movement, have to be committed to root ourselves in communities, represent workers not only at their workplace but wherever they live. Represent workers and speak for workers. It doesn't matter if you have a union card or you don't have a union card. At every intersections that they are at. So the challenge also is on us to show our value to communities, our value to people who are struggling. There are a lot of bright points. There is nothing more to me, as much as I've been lifted up. Jonathan and I talked about this before, about what the teachers have been doing, about using lunchrooms to organize, and not only to go out on a strike. They're not just workers striking. Workers are winning strikes. Workers are gaining through those strikes. We're living in a period of time that workers are saying enough is enough. In whatever happens, Janus happens. Randi can tell you, unions, Randi's union included, adjusted themselves, and they said, screw the law, we're going to go talk to workers. Mm-hmm. And minimize actually the damage that Janus was having. So we need to have a new paradigm. We need to have a new way of thinking. We need to focus back again into organizing. and invite new voices, invite young people, invite people of color into our rooms, into our boardrooms, into our union halls, to actually feel like that's their home and that's their place. I think we have a bright day ahead of us. I have so much faith in this generation of people. Most are work generation that I have known. They understand, but at the same time, we have also to be ready for them when they come to us.
So one thing that's been floating around that I've heard in some sectors, certainly among progressive activists, people who are, if you will, more on the left side of the spectrum, is they've listed the reality that, as Randi pointed out, 35, 40 million people are out of work. It's probably a lot more because there are millions of people who can't even access the unemployment system and therefore aren't being registered as unemployed. You've got the killing of George Floyd. You've got frontline workers. Randi and I talked about this recently on my audio podcast. You've got frontline workers in so many industries, from retail to poultry to healthcare, exposing themselves to the virus. And so some people are saying, and I'm asking you, Tafari, time for a general strike, shut down the country. What do you think about that?
Sort of above my pay grade, but you know, that being said, in order for that to happen, Jonathan, workers have to understand the power they have within them in paralyzing an economy and demanding for more things. It is easier to actually advocate for general strike than actually to do one, to do one itself. But you know, workers will do whatever they have to do when they are pushed to the brink. As you're seeing young Black men and young Black women and people of color taking the streets of America when they are being pushed to the brink, when there is no other way, when there is no other way of doing it. I don't know if we should have a general strike for the general strike sense, but a general strike that's going to get us something that somebody has to articulate that. Like if we actually do a general strike, we're gonna get something something at the end of it. Look, general strikes used to be easier when you used to have thousands and thousands of people working in an assembly plant. That's not the economy we have. We represent workers with shops under 20 people, and we represent workers all over the place. So I would love to see one in my lifetime, Jonathan, but like I said, it's above my pay grade.
What's your thought about Randi?
I've been asked this question often, and in the last few weeks, and you know, I think we have to always, strikes are effective when we either can do something where the withdrawal of our work makes people want to help us, or when we win a public narrative. The teacher strikes are effective these days because the public sees that the cause is righteous and that the cause is just. I think the Amazon strikes, the cart worker strikes, all of these, in terms of finding and making sure there was a really important, that the health and safety needs were met, really important. I would actually argue probably a meatpacking strike in some instances is probably very important. But what do I actually tell my members, the 200,000 of them who work in healthcare facilities right now and are trying to actually make sure they save lives? And so what is essential right now? What do we need to actually do to make sure that we feed people, we change, we care for people, we have the government, particularly these local governments, actually work effectively, we engage people? What is essential right now? And I think that the notion of finding a way to change the politics as well as change the policy is absolutely imperative. And so so at this moment in time, I am not in favor of a general strike in the next few days or the next couple of weeks. I am in favor of the protest movements. I think they're really important right now. I am in favor of finding every single way we can to, and every voter we can to oust this president in this next election, and to actually have the kind of revolution that we need to really change and rewrite the rules. And if a strike is needed as part of that process, then so be it. But let's actually try to do what we need to do to address all three of these crises at this moment.
And in fact, your point, and you made this point before about these three different phenomena that are happening all together. You use the years, the Great Depression, and other markers. Steve wrote a lot about the Red for Ed campaign, which made me think about this, that one of the great things about the Red for Ed campaign was it wasn't just teachers, it was the entire public mobilizing parents behind teachers because they saw that these policies of basically bankrupting states was hurting their kids and hurting schools. And so I think what people are saying, there's an analogy here, which is you've got 35 to 40 million people out of work in the greatest economic crisis, perhaps since the Great Depression. You've got all these frontline workers who have to go to work and are in unsafe conditions where employers like Tyson Foods just don't give a damn, or Amazon. And you've got the killing of George Floyd, and that those things together are these three streams that create this moment. And I'm just reflecting what I hear from other people. It creates this moment that is different from even 6 months ago. And I'm not saying that would happen 2 weeks from now, but something's happening.
Yes, and I think that but every time we have a strike, for those of us who have been really engaged in them, we need to have a target, and we need to actually be able to exert the kind of pressure on that target, and we need to be able to ensure that it is righteous. So what is the target right now? Is it the US Senate? Is it the President of the United States of America? Or is it a school district? Is it the Minnesota Minneapolis Police Department? So I completely concur with the frustration that people have that say, let's do this. But we need to actually accomplish things right now. And that's what the strikes that Steve was talking about, the Chicago teacher strike that was done with SEIU's locals as well, because the public understood what we were doing and why we were doing it. Look, if we don't get the funding that we need in terms of schools to reopen schools, I'm going to stand up and say we can't reopen schools. We need that funding from the Senate. We need that. You can't just flip a switch, as Donald Trump would have you believe. And you may see a whole bunch of teachers in September saying it's not going to happen. But, at least from my experience, when the public is with us, as the public is with the protesters right now, one can not only demand action, but try to get to enduring change. And that is what we need right now. That is what these three crises cry out for. So protest, escalating actions, one point or another, we may have to, but you don't start with a general strike. You start with what we need to do to try to get the change we need. And that requires changes in who's in office right now, particularly the presidency, and who's the majority of the Senate, as well as the policy, long-term and short-term policy changes.
Steve's almost jumping out of his chair there.
I just want to add my 2 cents.
Yeah, please do.
Randy put it very well. The issue now is, there's this, great energy in the streets right now. I mean, extraordinary energy, because something, horrible, horrific, horrendous happened. This, very graphic, visible murder of Mr. Floyd, and so the question is how to take this energy, these demonstrations, and turn them into long-term change. And Randy was laying out there these 3 strategies to do that. And it's not clear to me, how much a general strike would advance those goals. And I've, been in many situations where people say we could really use a general strike. But to have a successful general strike, you need an issue that people are humongously angry about. And you need amazing organization. I think, and if you want to have a successful general strike, you need 43% of workers to walk out, or 57% of workers to walk out, or is it 13% walk out? Is that a success? And if only 13% walk out, will that mean you'll have egg all over your face? You know, I think there are really 2 times in recent memory, I thought maybe a general strike would work. One was in the beginning of the pandemic, when we saw all these companies not doing nearly enough to protect their workers, you know, and these famous companies, Amazon, McDonald's, but it was a far less than ideal time to try to have a general strike, because I remember I was talking to someone who said, you know, why doesn't Richard Trump get called to have a demonstration of 5 million workers in Washington to talk about how workers are being screwed, you know, in this pandemic? I said,
because we were all locked down.
Because they're all locked down. People are not running to take, you know, buses and trains to Washington.
Yeah.
And similarly, even if we had general strikes in all these different cities, people are scared. It's hard to communicate. So, you know, general strike is a sexy notion. It's no coincidence that there hasn't been a general strike since what, the one in Oakland in 1946, which is a very long time ago. So, you know, you need extreme anger. And, you know, we have extreme anger right now, and we have this very healthy demonstration right now, you know, unhappiness with the Trump administration, unhappiness with the brutality of the police departments, you know, huge unhappiness with racism. And we need to turn this into long-term change to help build a fairer nation.
Did you take part in that general strike in 1946, Steve?
No, but I was at the UC Berkeley Labor Center, and they have the most amazing photographs of that.
I'm just teasing you. We're going to take a question in a second, but I want to put up the graphic of Steve's book again, if we can, so that people remember what it looks like. And I'll actually put up, here we go. The book again is Beaten Down, Worked Up, The Past, Present, and Future of American Labor by Steve. And as I said before Steve came on the show, it's coming out in paperback on July 21st, I believe. And this is going to actually lead perfectly into the question that was submitted, believe it or not. I was telling people that they should not, and this is not going to, I don't want Steve to be saying this because his publisher will probably have a heart seizure. Don't buy this on Amazon. Buy it from an independent bookstore. I'm a Powell's fan. It's powells.com. And buy lots of copies, because for those of us who want to see more labor books written, the way that happens is if we buy the books, as I did here, and when the pandemic is over, I'm going to somehow see Steve and have him sign it. We've got to buy books like this so that publishers will want to make and allow authors like Steve to write additional books like this. So we do have a question from Nicole, I believe, who asked the question, and this is relevant to Amazon. I'll throw it out to any of you. Thoughts on whether Jeff Bezos will ever make any concessions to unions?
You already did.
Talk a little bit about that.
You already did. Somali workers in Minnesota held his feet to the fire. They just said, we're not going to do it unless you sit down and talk. I know Amazon doesn't want to call it a collective bargaining agreement. Whatever they want to call it, they sat across the table with those workers, agreed on work conditions, provided prior time for those workers, increased their pays, and reduced the amount of boxes that they have to box. So not only Jeff Bezos, it's not only about Jeff Bezos. There isn't any CEO in this country who wants to invite unions in. They have never given us anything willingly. We take it by workers coming together and saying that's mine. When that happens, Amazon will happen. It's not about Bezos. It's about us doing it. It would be nice if the rules are actually favoring us to do that instead of throwing obstacles all over the place on us. But I'm not going to ask for Jeff Bezos' permission or good grace to organize. That's never going to work.
And also, you know, Jeff Bezos, Amazon is doing a lot more, you know, since all these worker protests and press coverage, a lot more to assure safety on COVID-19. A lot of that wouldn't be happening were it not for these worker protests. Having said that, you know, Amazon does everything it can to keep out a union. It fired Christian Smalls, the African-American worker who led the walkout in Staten Island. It fired the East African worker and the main activist in Minneapolis. It fired two climate activists in Seattle who were also speaking out on behalf of the warehouse workers. So Amazon is incredibly anti-union. And in Germany, there have been repeated strikes against Amazon, and unions in Germany are much more powerful than here in the United States. And Bezos just will have no truck with them. Doesn't want to deal with them at all. So it really is testament to the power of these Somali workers in Minneapolis and some of these workers in the US that they have won some important gains from Amazon. But as Tafari said, you have to keep on pushing and keep on fighting.
And I assume this goes to the point that Randi made before about the different changes that have to happen politically. And you were speaking to the presumptive nominee of a major party just a little bit ago. One of the things that's been frustrating, I know, for us in the labor movement is that over the course of several decades, we have often had a Democratic Party that has not been fighting all the way for the things that we need. For example, I remember during the Clinton administration, we had a chance to pass a striker replacement bill, which could not get pushed through because of the two senators from Arkansas, Bumpers and Pryor, basically were filibustering. And then you've got the Employee Free Choice Act, as Steve pointed out in the book. It just was not a high priority, and it was not like the number one thing to push through. So Randi, isn't that in some way one of the things that we have to hope for and push for and organize for, which is to change some of those laws?
Right. So I don't think it's about hoping for it. I think it's about organizing.
Yeah.
I think we actually have to think about this notion of both organizing or activism and elections that create policy change. We often feel, and I saw it, in the election of Barack Obama, that there was this sense of, okay, we did our work, we finished, January 20th come around, and he's just going to do everything. And then there was huge disappointment that either he didn't or he had a different view, like in terms of education and the sense of, well, that's not what we voted for. And people voting for both the messenger and the message, but not actually understanding kind of the levers of government and purposes of government. So as you were talking before about Amazon, I'm thinking, yeah, the lever would be for organizing. What if we had that OSHA emergency standard? Mm-hmm. So we actually use it as a way of not just raising the issue, but having a way to solve the problem, which is part of why people have been so disenchanted with Democrats. There's another reason, which is the money in politics, which is, when people say, oh, well, they've promised the moon, the stars, everything, even the lightning that you just saw outside. And then when they get into office, all of the, normal issues around government and how you can actually get things done, the obstacles are there. That's where the activism comes in. We have to do both, but we have to actually solve problems to create trust. It's part of the reason why, and Steve raised this before, think about the 2 collective bargaining contracts in Chicago that had 2 strikes over the course of 10 years. The collective bargaining contract that was just gotten after this strike was significantly better than the first one after Karen's iconic strike. And why? Because that one was about stopping Ram from taking things away. This one was about building on what we had to make things better. Mm-hmm. But the second one would never have happened without the first one. So part of this is the creation of trust about not only what is achievable, but how do you push that and how you empower people so that they are part of their own success. It really has to be activism and elections, protest and politics in order to actually build the building blocks for real enduring change.
Tafari, do you want to comment? You want to pick up on that?
I just also say, if I don't get a chance to say it again, Steve, over the course of our work, we both have been around since dinosaurs roamed.
I've been around since you were a social studies teacher.
Yes, yes. But his book is fabulous. And it's not just the history, but it's the strategies that he pulls out to actually help teach activists how to use infrastructure and organize in meaningful ways. And I've learned a lot from Steve Greenhouse, and I'm really, really glad he's written that book. And I'm really glad every time I spend time with him, I really learn a lot from him. So thank you, Steve.
Thank you. Thank you.
Tafari.
Just on Steve, just to pile on, not one, I have two books of yours, two of your books, just Jonathan's point of supporting labor books to come out. Not really much to add from what Randy has said, but I just want to bring us back to, I don't think the country has been in a mood for unions as it is right now. In survey after survey, about 70+% of millennials say they would like to join a union if they can. That's why you were seeing a lot of .com newsrooms getting organized right and left. We're making some progress in Silicon Valley. Organizing is hard, but it has always been hard. It's not as hard as when they used to send militias to actually mow you down because you're trying to organize. We just have to reorient ourselves, organizing first, organizing second, organizing third, and everything else will come after that. By organizing, I don't mean just only workplace organizing for politics, looking at our politics from a lens of organizing. That we're creating an enduring relationship with our movement and workers and voters, and making sure that not only we're asking them to vote for people we want them to vote to, but we're going back and asking them to help us hold those people accountable to the things that they have promised to do. And that's what I sometimes call agenda-driven politics. When our agenda drives our politics, we do well. When politics leads our agenda never gets to be completed. Those are the things that we just have to correct.
So the final question that just came in, and maybe we can pick out, and then we'll wrap up our conversation. We've sort of talked about this already, but maybe we can focus in on one idea. And the question is, how do we combat the many years of anti-union propaganda to make young and exploited workers more hungry to join unions? I know we've talked about generalities, but if you were to take one thing, you had only one chance for one thing to do that today, what would you do? Randi.
They see themselves in the union. They have to see themselves in the work. And they have to see that it is meaningful to them in some way, form, or another. There's what we try to do is we try to do many different platforms, many different avenues, on-ramps for people to join. But I'll give you an example. We had a teacher who is one of the named plaintiffs in one of the suits that we are doing against Devos and Navient and others in terms of student loan debt. And during COVID, during the first couple of weeks, the first few weeks of COVID, I get pinged and from one of my staff saying, you need to look outside your apartment. And I looked outside onto Academy Street. I couldn't see anything. No. Look at the sidewalk. I went downstairs and there was this art teacher just had done this amazing art right outside on Academy Street. Just to say thank you, because she had just finished paying off her loan because we had gotten her the public service loan forgiveness that she had been fighting for years. The teachers in the Chicago strike, the day before the strike ended, and then the day after, saying, we have accomplished something. We have seen what we have accomplished through our power. a member of mine in New York, a lab specialist who was on a bargaining committee when we had a 300-member bargaining committee. When we ended up getting to a contract in, I think it was 2007, she had tears in her eyes. And she said, I've never felt this level of empowerment. That kind of sense of agency, and that people have through collective action, they can accomplish what is impossible to do alone. That is the spark, I have found at least, that people say, I want to be part of this. It has to relate in a way that's meaningful to someone, really meaningful.
Steve?
So the question, how do we combat the many years of anti-union propaganda to make young and exploited workers more hungry to join unions?
And I said, think of one thing. You don't get to take 10, one.
Here come 10. So I think a lot of young exploited workers would vote to join a union tomorrow if they could. As Tafari said, 60, 70% of these people, surveys show would join a union. There are two big problems preventing them. It's not that unions need a magical message. It's that they're very scared to stick their necks out because employers so often fire people for supporting a union. So I think one thing you need to do is really increase the penalties against employers that crack down on, suppress, intimidate, fire workers for saying, I want a union. Again, people don't begin to understand the level of intimidation and retaliation against workers for supporting a union. That needs to change. The laws now, employers who break the law of firing union supporters can't even be fined, not even 1 penny. So we need laws to strengthen that. A second thing, and I say this in speeches and in my book, the system is very tilted in favor of corporations and against unions and workers. And there are many reasons for that. One is the filibuster system, so we can have 40 conservative senators, and the way the Senate's created on the Constitution, it's very easy to have 40 conservative senators that will block any pro-worker, pro-union legislation. You take that with our very warped, unfair campaign finance system, where corporations spend 16 times as much as labor unions each campaign. So things are really arrayed against workers. So I think we really, to help ensure that workers can have a fair voice in the workplace and in politics, we have to fix our incredibly, extraordinarily broken campaign finance system, which won't be easy.
So in parallel to the penalties about organizing, I would just point out also that we need to increase penalties and include jail time for violations of safety and health, because the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, when there's a violation in the workplace of, in the example of Amazon, for example, where people are falling over from heat, places being too hot, or actually injuries, the fines are just slap on the wrist. Tafari, what about your one thing as we wrap up our conversation?
Sure, help us change the rules. And in order to change the rules, we need to elect rule makers. Help us elect people in office who could help us rewrite the rules.
Okay.
I'm going to interrupt. I'm going to follow up. So, a lot of progressives don't love Joe Biden. They'd much rather have Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren. If Joe Biden were president rather than Donald Trump, we would have, effective emergency rules on COVID-19, protecting workers from COVID-19. Maybe Joe Biden isn't Bernie Sanders, but in many ways he will be infinitely better than Donald Trump in protecting workers. And I think it's important for people to realize that.
Well, just on the level of the appointments at the National Labor Relations Board, that makes a big difference. You could see the switch in administrations from, in fact, Randi knows this quite well, the rules around organizing university graduate students, how they've bounced back and forth depending on what administration controlled the National Labor Relations Board. So those are very practical things, as Steve points out. And you can read more and more about Steve's experience, his talk about his campaigns. I only skim the surface of what's in this book. There's just incredible, it's really rich in detail. I loved reading the book, Steve. Please do buy the book, folks. You can do that again at your independent bookstore. It's my hobby horse to promote independent bookstores. Again, this is now going to be a regular show. Next week, we're going to have an incredible show just devoted to the unemployment system, the broken unemployment system. Judy Conti from the National Employment Law Project is going to be my guest. And we're going to go through very concretely, especially for the millions of workers who, many of whom have confronted the system for the first time. We're going to go through and explain why the system is in chaos, why it's falling apart, and how people can access it and how it needs to be fixed. So please join us for that show. Please do sign up and subscribe to this show. I want to thank my guest, Randi Weingarten, always a great guest on my podcast in the past, president of the American Federation of Teachers, my brother, Tefere Gebre, who's the executive director of the Afl-Cio, and the author, Stephen Greenhouse. And good night to everybody. Thanks for being with us.